The final days were the quietest and the most dangerous. Thomas stopped searching for answers, or at least that's what he let Margaret believe. He moved through the house like a shadow, careful not to reveal the new plan forming in his mind. But something had changed in her too. She watched him less openly now, yet he could feel her eyes on him all the same, as if she knew every thought before it reached the surface. The townspeople noticed his absence from the workshop. They whispered when they saw him, the same way they had whispered after Eleanor vanished. Old Samuel Price crossed his path again outside the post office, leaning in close enough for Thomas to smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "You don't end it," Price muttered. "It ends you." When Thomas demanded to know what he meant, the old man only walked away, his cane striking the pavement like a clock counting down. One night, while Margaret slept, Thomas returned to the cellar. He carried a lantern and a length of rope. The air was colder than before, the shadows thicker. He set the lantern on the floor and pulled down one of the ledgers. This time he noticed something he had missed. Entries marked not just with EG, but with other initials, spanning decades. Each ended the same way. Transfer complete. The truth was too large to hold in his mind at once. This was not a love story. This was a lineage of possession, a chain stretching back further than he could see, with Eleanor and now Margaret as only the most recent links. And Thomas. Thomas was next. When he climbed back up the steps, Margaret was waiting in the doorway, the silver locket dangling from her hand. "You went looking for the wrong answers again," she said. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were alive in a way that made his blood turn to ice. In the days that followed, Thomas's memory began to slip. Entire hours vanished. He would wake in unfamiliar rooms, find dirt beneath his fingernails, smell smoke in his hair. Margaret would sit across from him at breakfast, her smile patient, her gaze unblinking. The last clear thought he remembered having was this. When he looked at her, he no longer saw Eleanor. He saw himself, reflected perfectly in the depths of her gaze, and somewhere deep inside, a voice, not his own, whispered, "Transfer complete." From that night on, the house no longer felt like his. Margaret moved through it as though she had built every wall herself. She knew which floorboards creaked, which hinges groaned in protest, and which spots in the hall caught the moonlight just right. Thomas found himself shrinking into the corners, avoiding her gaze, avoiding her voice. But she had a way of finding him, of appearing just where he didn't want her to be. The dreams became worse. Eleanor would speak to him now, though her words were broken, as if they came from a great distance. Sometimes she would warn him to leave. Other times she would tell him he had already stayed too long. And more, when she spoke, it was Margaret's mouth that moved. One evening, he woke to find Margaret sitting beside the bed, watching him sleep. She held the silver locket in her hands, rolling it slowly between her fingers. "Do you remember?" she said softly. "The night I left?" She didn't say Eleanor. She didn't have to. Thomas tried to leave the next morning. He packed a bag, waited for her to walk to the market, and slipped out the back door. But when he reached the road, Margaret was already there, standing in the fog. "You can't leave," she said, her voice almost pitying. "We've been through this before." That night, Thomas sat in the dark kitchen with the letters spread out before him, reading and rereading until the words blurred. There was no explanation for what he was seeing, not in the laws of men, not in the faith his mother had clung to. Eleanor had not simply returned. She had found a way to inhabit another life. Margaret's life. The last letter in the stack was different from the others. It wasn't dated. It wasn't even finished. But it carried one sentence that rooted itself in Thomas's mind and would not let go. "When you look into my eyes, you will see yourself." From then on, Thomas stopped lays, oaking into Margaret's eyes entirely. He spoke to her without meeting her gaze, moved through the house without letting his shadow cross hers. But late one night, While walking past the parlor, he caught her reflection in the window. And in that reflection, for the briefest moment, it wasn't Margaret who looked back at him. It was himself, younger, weaker, afraid. The next morning, the locket was gone. The answer began to take shape in the one place Thomas had avoided since Eleanor vanished, the cellar beneath the old grey house. It wasn't part of their home anymore. The farmhouse had been divided and sold off years before, but the cellar remained locked, sealed with rusted chains and a heavy padlock. Thomas had kept the key, though he didn't remember why, perhaps because some part of him knew this was where the truth had been buried. One evening, after Margaret had gone to visit a neighbor, Thomas walked to the property with the key in his pocket. The sun was low, spilling long shadows across the field. The lock gave way easier than it should have, as if someone had oiled it recently. The air inside was cold, damp, and carried the faint metallic scent of old blood. He lit a lantern and descended the stone steps. The walls were lined with shelves, but not with jars or tools, with books, dozens of them, ledgers, journals, and scrapbooks filled with photographs of women who all looked similar. Some bore Eleanor's face, some Margaret's. Some faces were younger, others older, but the same features repeated over and over across decades. At the far end of the room stood a single wooden chair. On the seat, a box. Inside the box, a thin stack of papers tied with twine, letters, all written in Eleanor's hand. But the dates stretched far beyond when she had supposedly vanished. Letters from the 1910s, the 1920s, even one dated 1939. Thomas's hands trembled as he read. The letters spoke of returning when the body fades, of finding the next vessel through the bond of blood. He didn't want to understand the words, but his mind gave him no choice. It was not that Margaret looked like Eleanor. It was not coincidence. This was Eleanor, or something that had been wearing her, carried forward into new flesh, bound by a bloodline Thomas could not escape. He left the sea, Ella with the letters clutched to his chest, the lantern's flame shivering in the wind. As he reached his own door, he saw Margaret waiting on the porch, her eyes glinting in the fading light. She smiled, not warmly, not kindly, but knowingly, as if she had been waiting for him to remember everything. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, and Thomas, for the first time in his life, could not answer. The locks brought no comfort. If anything, they made Thomas more aware of her presence. He would lie in bed, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards as Margaret paced the hallway outside. Sometimes he would hear her stop just beyond the door, her breathing slow and deliberate, as though she were waiting for him to speak first. On other nights, he'd wake to the sound of humming, that same lullaby, but softer now, almost like she was humming directly into his dreams. He began to notice the change in her eyes. In the first weeks of their marriage, they had seemed warm, almost shy. But now they carried a weight, a knowing heaviness, as if she was remembering something he could not. And the more he avoided her gaze, the more he caught her staring not like a wife looks at her husband, but like a predator studying something it already owns. One rainy afternoon, Thomas received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. The edges were curled with age, the image grainy and faded. But the faces were clear. It was Eleanor standing in front of the old grey house, her hair pinned back, her smile faint. Beside her stood a man Thomas didn't recognize. But the third figure made his breath stop. It was Margaret. The same Margaret who now stood in his kitchen, boiling tea. The same Margaret who claimed to have met Eleanor only once. When he confronted her, she didn't flinch. She simply said, "You don't remember everything that happened here, but I do." Her voice was steady, calm, as though she were explaining a fact of nature. That night, he searched the house while she slept. In the bottom drawer of her dresser, wrapped in a length of silk, he found a small silver locket. Inside, 2 photographs faced each other. On one side, Eleanor, as he remembered her at 17. On the other, Margaret, identical except for the lines of age. And behind the photos, A scrap of paper. 3 words written in Eleanor's hand. Blood remembers blood. Thomas sat in the darkness for hours, the locket warm in his palm. He realized the question was no longer who Margaret was. It was how she was here at all. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The more Thomas searched for answers, the more the world around him seemed to close in. Redford was a small town, smaller than it liked to admit, and its people carried long memories. But when Thomas began asking questions about Eleanor, conversations would break like glass. Men at the general store suddenly remembered errands. Women in the churchyard lowered their voices until they were nothing but wind. Even his own mother refused to speak her daughter's name, as if it had been written on a gravestone no one could see. Margaret noticed his restlessness. One evening, while he was sanding the leg of a chair in his workshop, she stepped into the doorway and leaned against the frame. She said she knew he'd been thinking about his sister. She said it without accusation, but her eyes glinted with something unreadable. Thomas froze, the rasp of the sandpaper slowing until it stopped altogether. He hadn't told her Eleanor's name. She stepped closer, the smell of lilacs and rain on her skin, and whispered, "You're asking the wrong questions." Then she left, leaving the words hanging in the air like the scent of burning wood after the flames are gone. That night, Thomas returned to the attic, but not to Margaret's boxes. He dug through his father's old ledger, a thick, leather-bound book filled with debts, names, and transactions no one was meant to see. On the back pages, in cramped handwriting, he found a string of entries marked with the initials E.G. They began a year before Eleanor disappeared and ended abruptly the same month she was gone. The amounts were large for a man like his father, and the final note read only, "Paid in full, transfer complete." Transfer. The word gnawed at him. The next day, he confronted Margaret. She didn't deny knowing Eleanor. In fact, she told him she'd met her once, just once, when she was a child. She claimed she barely read the meeting, only that Eleanor had been kind. But the way she said the name, slow and deliberate, made Thomas's stomach turn. Later that week, while passing the old mill on the edge of town, Thomas ran into Samuel Price, a man who'd worked for his father decades ago. Price looked older than time itself, his eyes yellowed, his voice like gravel. When Thomas asked about Eleanor, Price's hand tightened on his cane. "Some people," he said, "don't stay gone. They just come back wearing different names." That night, Thomas began locking the bedroom door. Not to keep anyone out, to keep Margaret in. It began with the dreams. At first they were soft, almost comforting. Thomas would find himself in the old grey farmhouse, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and rain. Eleanor would be there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her hair falling over her eyes, humming the same song she used to sing while brushing his hair when he was a boy. But as the nights passed, the dreams sharpened, became jagged. Eleanor would turn toward him, her face flickering between hers and Margaret's, her eyes locking on his with something between pleading and warning. One night, Thomas woke to find Margaret standing at the foot of the bed, her long hair hanging damp against her nightgown. She was humming. That same tune. She claimed she'd been sleepwalking, something she'd done as a child, she said, but the way she smiled when she said it made his skin tighten. Thomas tried to reason with himself. Similarities happen, people resemble each other, but the past doesn't mimic the present so precisely without reason. He began noticing other things. Margaret knew the exact way to fix his coffee, a habit he'd never mentioned. She avoided mentioning her own childhood, and when pressed, she would steer the conversation back to him, asking about his youth in the grey house. Sometimes she knew answers before he spoke them. One Sunday, while unpacking old crates in the attic, Thomas found something strange in a box marked Margaret's Keepsakes. Inside was a single yellowed envelope. The name written on it was Eleanor Gray. The handwriting was his sister's. The letter inside was dated 1907, 2 years before Eleanor vanished. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but it read like a confession. It spoke of leaving before father's temper could finish what it started, of finding a place where blood doesn't matter and names can be changed. There were hints of someone helping her, but the name was never written. Thomas sat in the dust for nearly an hour, staring at the paper, his hands shaking. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay beside Margaret, listening to the even rhythm of her breathing. Every few minutes he'd glance over, catching the pale glow of moonlight in her eyes, and every time he swore he saw Eleanor staring back at him, older, colder, and utterly unrecognizable in her silence. The feeling that his wife was a stranger was one thing, but now Thomas was starting to believe she wasn't a stranger at all. They say love is blind, but in the small town of Redford, Michigan, love saw too much. The summer of 1924 was heavy with heat and secrets, the kind of summer where whispers moved faster than the breeze, and everyone's window was open just enough to hear them. Thomas Gray was a quiet man, a furniture maker, known for his patience and the soft, deliberate way he spoke. When he married Margaret Doyle, the town called it a match made in heaven, though heaven, as we know, has its shadows. On their wedding day, Thomas stood at the altar, smiling at the woman who was now his wife. But when she looked at him, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just her hazel eyes. Plenty of women had hazel eyes. It was the way she looked at him, the slight tilt of her head, the way her lips curved before she spoke. He had seen it before, years ago, on the face of a girl who had been gone for nearly 2 decades. His sister, Eleanor. Eleanor had vanished when Thomas was 10. She was 17 then, with a quiet defiance that unsettled their father and a strange tenderness that only Thomas seemed to understand. One rainy October night, she left the house and never came back. The family said she ran away. The neighbors said she was taken. Thomas never found out the truth. Or perhaps he never wanted to. But now, as Margaret slid her hand into his, the memory surged back like a wound reopening. That same expression, the one Eleanor wore when she was about to tell him a secret, flickered across Margaret's face. For a moment, it was as if his sister had returned, dressed in white, standing where his bride should be. The honeymoon passed quietly, but Thomas found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. Not in the way a husband watches his wife, but the way a man studies a photograph he thought was lost. And the more he looked, the more the details betrayed him. The same dimple in her left cheek, the same delicate scar above her eyebrow, the same faint hum she made when she was deep in thought. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. Yet deep down, Thomas felt a truth he could not name, and it was beginning to rot the foundations of his marriage before it had even begun.